first, I think, to be here speaking to you this evening. I feel privileged to really be here, and I cannot thank you enough for your participation in this process. And thank you to Tess as well for her cogent introduction. I think my presentation will complement nicely what she said. I was told my role was to try to define just transition. And I will start by saying that defining what a just transition is extremely difficult. Partially, it's difficult because it's used in very different ways and in very different contexts. So I thought of some examples that perhaps all of you may have heard this concept of just transition in different ways. So Tessa, for example, talked about the struggles of workers to actually claim that their rights and livelihoods are protected when we shift away from fossil fuels. For example, in mining regions or other regions that depend from fossil fuels. But the idea of just transition is also used more generally in environmental policy. For example, the European Union has done a new regulation which is called the European Green Deal. And the idea of just transition is embedded in the European Green Deal as something to think about the balance between regions and how different regions respond to environmental policy. But the way that I've been using it myself and among environmental movements is more broad, is the way we think about just transition as affecting our lives and affecting our cities and affecting our neighborhoods. And as something that calls for a change, but also reflects on the consequences of those changes. So in that sense, I think we should think about just transitions in terms of what do they mean for us in practice. So what I'm going to try to do is to define those words. First transition and then just or justice. So what is a transition? I mean, we've just seen now the extent of the challenge of the changes required. So I wrote you here a quote: addressing global environmental challenges requires a fundamental reorganization of current production and consumption systems, which means abandoning growth as the main strategy for achieving the well-being of humans. So this kind of change is enormous, and it refers to two different things. One is mitigating emissions, which is the part that we've already talked before about what is climate justice. So you can think about it as being less polluting and kind of transforming our consumption and production systems so that they are not so contaminating and that we don't emit so many climate change gases to the atmosphere. But at the same time, we also have to adapt to existing climate impacts. And as Tessa has explained, they are already taking place in many places are visible around the world, but also in the UK. And we have to cope and navigate those changes that are already happening in our environment. So the extent of the challenge is so much that it involves fundamental questions about who we are and what do we want as individuals, as communities, as neighborhoods, as countries. And also there's one thing that, in my view, nobody really knows how this transition will look like. So a lot of people have a lot of proposals, but it's about a diversity of proposals that can take place in different places and what is feasible in different places. The idea of justice is very complicated, but I try to summarize here 4 things that have direct relevance to your work and that relates to achieving environmental justice. So what this diagram, which is a bit complex, but I'll try to explain these 4 aspects one by one. So one aspect is to think about the equal distributions of benefits and burdens. The second aspect is the recognition of our societies as diverse and being integrated by many different types of people with different needs and different constraints. The third aspect is to enable processes that give voice to everyone in that process. And a fourth aspect, which is more broad, and it relates to our planet and our future, is the respect for the Earth limits. So if we go to the first aspect on the equal distribution of benefit and burdens, I would define it as considering, so thinking about justice and the just transition would entail sharing both the climate risks and the consequences of carbon emission reductions. And as I say, this relates to those two aspects of the transition, both of mitigating and adapting. So in terms of risks, you may already know that climate change is having direct impacts in our health, both affecting our subjective well-being, but also affecting our health, our homes, in terms of how we live, our houses, and how we can cope with different changes through heat waves and so on. Climate change can also impact food and services. Access to food, for example, may be a big problem. And also climate change impacts aspects of conflict and democracy, and there's a big concern about climate migrants and so on. So these are the different impacts, and how those impacts affect different people is something that has to be central to our concerns. But at the same time, we have to think that it's not only about the impact of climate change, but also about the impact of our responses to climate change. Well, so it's not only about the impact of climate change, but also about the impact of climate action. So this is, for example, a quote from a report from UN Habitat that says, while environmental projects are adding value to urban environments, some are having unintended impacts, particularly on marginalized groups who are being pushed out by the changing conditions of habitation, such as the appreciation of property values and rental costs. So climate change is now starting to be linked with something called climate gentrification, affecting the most marginalized people inside cities. So that was the first aspect of climate justice, the equal distribution of benefits and burdens. It relates to the outcomes of our actions and responses to the climate change challenge. But also there is these other aspects that relate more to the process. And one is this recognition of different groups. So when we think about just transitions, whatever way we look at just transitions, we have to recognize that all people are autonomous, free, and equal. And we have to ensure that whatever proposals we make in planning or in policy and so on, incorporate the different needs and the different constraints that people live with. So, I mean, it won't be a surprise to you if I say that our social structures favor some people more than others, and that life will likely be easier if you are a man or if you are white, if you are able-bodied, if you are cisgender, that is, if your gender corresponds to the gender you were assigned at birth, if you are heterosexual, or if you are rich or you are from high classes, and so on. So this, which is a fact of life that we live in our everyday lives, is going to become even more salient when our environment changes, and both in terms of the way different impacts affect us, and also in the ways that we can cope with those impacts. For example, some people can make more sacrifices than others. So here is, for example, a photo from Hanoi that I think illustrates that nicely. It's like, who can maybe evacuate a city? Who can deal with a city that is flooding? So whose business are most affected? Whose houses are most affected? And again, as we say, it's about the impacts of, about how the climate change impacts affect different populations, but also how the impacts of our actions to respond to climate change affect different populations. So for example, if we posit that cycling is a way to reduce the emissions from cars in London, how is that going to affect different groups? So who feels safe cycling on the streets of London? And this is open for review, because it will depend very strongly on what different perceptions of cycling there are. But there have been some discussion about how biking tends to favor middle to high income groups and more privileged people. So when we think about what policies are best for climate change, we have to think about what kinds of policies may favor more disadvantaged people. So particularly people from multiple abilities in the case of transport, women, the young and the elderly, people from different ethnic groups. So the third aspect I wanted to speak about is that climate justice and just transitions, when we think about just transitions, we have to think about how that process of change, and we are talking about a radical change in our lives, in our conceptions of ourselves, we have to think who is given a voice in that process and who is being excluded from that process. Can we have a process, a policy-making process or a decision-making process that gives a voice to everyone? And that will require to facilitating the participation of a range of voices and the representation of multiple interests, and also the representation of conflict as part of the diversity of views that exist. So for me, climate assemblies are a wonderful way in which this is, and they're really radically changing how people are seeing the process of policy making in response to climate change. But even if we have a climate assembly, can we make sure in this assembly that all the voices are heard and represented? Because we ourselves have the responsibility. If we are in a forum, I imagine a remote digital connection is different than an in-person connection. But when you have a forum in general, some voices tend to dominate, and some people would feel more confident to speak. Certainly a white male who is accustomed to maybe be respected in most forums would have more access to that forum. Sometimes these people are just more shy or more timid and may struggle to speak. So we have to make sure we are listening to all those other voices. And also in terms of planning neighborhoods and planning cities, I think it's very important to think about what is the city that works for everyone. So we did some research in Lebanon for how to build spaces, public spaces, environmentally friendly spaces for disabled people. And the people who conducted this research found that if you design the city for disabled people, you are designing a city for everyone. So in the same way, if we are designing policies for climate change that address the needs of the most vulnerable, you are designing policies that work for everyone. And finally, as I already mentioned, when we are negotiating difficult problems, there are going to be inherent tensions. We shouldn't be afraid of those tensions. We should maybe work with them and see how they generate, but also at the same time be willing to listen to each other. It's not about creating a consensus. It's about listening to all those voices and see whether some way forward can be found through that negotiation. And finally, this idea of respecting the earth limits. So there's, in the environmental movement, there's long been this idea that the earth has some limits about how much it can carry, and we have to understand what those limits are and live within them. If we think about a just transition, we have to start to acknowledge our relationship with our environment and the need for abandoning extractive practices that may exploit the earth and not necessarily for our well-being. So there are many ways to think about it, and I thought that perhaps one that could be useful could be this one, which is from Kate Raworth, a social scientist at the University of Oxford. And she talks about this donut economics. And what is most important is in this donut is these two circles, the one that says ecological ceiling and the one that says social foundation. And what Kate Raworth argues is that we have to live between those two circles. If we go below the social foundation, the part in the center is when some of our needs for social equality, for political voice, for water, for food, for health, some of those needs are not met. We have to ensure that everybody's needs are met. And kind of international policy programs like the Sustainable Development Goals are based on this idea that we have to find this kind of lower ceiling that everybody's well-being is supported. And the external circle of the ecological ceiling would mark the limit of different aspects from air pollution, climate change, ocean acidification, chemical pollution, so the external boundaries of the limits of the Earth. This is just one way to think about it, because in a way, there are many ways of living on the Earth, but the question is, what of those ways, which of those ways can be respectful enough, can we be reflective enough so that we can develop better systems to create, to not exacerbate this challenge of climate change we are living through. So thank you. I hope this is useful, and I'll try to answer as many questions as you have.